So we've all heard many biodiversity stats. There's 1 million species that are threatened with extinction within many decades. There's 85% of wetlands, salt marshes, and mangroves which have practically disappeared. We're also learning that biodiversity and climate are intricately linked. We can't have one without the other. And to achieve our climate objectives, we need to urgently act to preserve nature and ecosystems. So it's clear that the investment community needs to take action. However, as of today, we estimate that only 1 billion is invested across 15 biodiversity labeled funds globally. Many of us have spent the last few years grappling with how to measure climate change and climate risk and look at the metrics and how to integrate all of those, even though we already know what the core metric is for climate. And now we have to do all of that for biodiversity, which is far more complex. We have to look at land, water, air, species. It's very complex and challenging, and there's a lot of challenges with the data. Thankfully, I think we can really leverage what we've learned on our journey in climate and apply that to biodiversity. One great example is launched this week of the TNFD. It borrows heavily from the TCFD, a framework that we've all become very intimate with. And so hopefully that can help give us the terminology and the frameworks to apply when addressing biodiversity. So today we're going to tackle a lot of these questions. We're going to look at the relationship between biodiversity and climate, what investors are doing to take action today, how we can leverage AI to fill some of those data gaps, and the role of investors, regulators, and standard setters in accelerating action on biodiversity. We have an exceptional panel today, so hopefully you will not be hearing much from me and only from them. To my left, we have Camille Maclet, who's the Finance Sector Engagement Lead for the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. I think that's my main achievement today, is actually saying that. He's been critical in his work with the COP15 and also the TNFD. Next we have Simpson, the Global Head of Sustainability at Franklin Templeton and the founding chair of the Climate Action 100+. Next we have Jeff Sternberg, Technical Director, Sustainability in Google Cloud's Office of the CTO. And finally, Vian Sharif, the founder of NatureAlpha and the Global Head of Sustainability at FNZ Group. So, I think we talk a lot about biodiversity, and many of us are very familiar, but for those who aren't, and it's a relatively new concept, Vian, can you share a short definition and some specific examples of biodiversity, and specifically, how is it relevant to companies?
A great question, and thank you for hosting us all, and it's wonderful to have everybody in the room listening to this, especially given this week's milestone, the launch of the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures. So if we were to define biodiversity, it's really the variety of species and life on Earth, which is a big definition. But the best way I've heard it described to me, so that I can understand why it's important, is who knows how to play Jenga? Have you played Jenga? Okay. Just play Jenga. Electronic Jenga. Imagine you start taking out one block, then you take out another block, and they represent a species. In fact, you could take it one step further and say biodiversity is just one facet of nature. So you start taking out the water, you start taking out a species here, you start pushing out a piece which represents soil, and so on and so forth, until you get to a place where that Jenga tower is not very resilient anymore. And at some point, it's going to collapse. So why it's important for investors to understand biodiversity and the part that it plays in companies' operations is that companies do depend on these ecosystem services. They depend on all of those blocks that we've just talked about. And if one of those goes, then not just the system falls, but potentially the company's future ability to do business using those ecosystem services becomes much, much harder to do. Beer factory can't source the water that it needs from the aquifer because the water table has been depleted because the tree cover has gone, so the trees, either invasive species have sucked up the water or they're just not holding them in because of deforestation. You have to move the factory. What's that going to cost the company in 5, 10, 15 years? What does the company need to do to plan? These are some practical examples of how a concept like biodiversity might factor into why it's important for decision making for investors and their investee companies.
Camille, what's the relationship between climate and biodiversity? How does biodiversity affect climate change mitigation and adaptation? And does climate change also affect biodiversity and ecosystem loss and extinction? And can you also speak to why we're suddenly talking about biodiversity a lot more?
Thank you. I will probably start with that last question to start with. So you mentioned the Secretariat of the Convention on Biological Diversity. This is the UN entity that convened COP15 that took place in December last year. Now, what happened at COP15? Several things happened. One thing was that for the first time in the history of biodiversity COPs, where 196 countries gather to negotiate an international policy agreement and directions on biodiversity, for the first time, the attendance from the business and the finance community was huge. We had 1,300 and counting businesses, corporate businesses, and over 150 financial institutions. This had never happened before, and they were here to advocate in favor of an ambitious agreement that would set the landscape for decisive action on restoring and protecting nature. This agreement came out, and I think the message from the business and finance community was clearly heard, and COP ended with the adoption of a very ambitious global biodiversity framework. Now, coming to your first question, some people have coined the term that the global biodiversity framework is the equivalent of the Paris Agreement, and COP15 was even called the Paris moment for nature. I think that what this agreement sets is a framework for alignment of policymakers, regulators, but also businesses and finance with a common goal for nature. Now, there's a small difference there. In Paris, the agreed goal was well below 2 degrees by 2050, and if possible, 1.5 degrees. In the Global Biodiversity Framework, we have a shared vision, which is quite vague, ambitious but vague, living in harmony with nature by 2050. And then 23 specific action targets to 2030. And this epitomizes, I think, the key difference between climate action and nature action. Biodiversity is inherently complex, location-specific, multifaceted, and we expect regulators, countries, but also the business community, and especially data providers such as MSCI, NatureAlpha, and others, to support building the right metrics and data offerings in particular to help build alignment with that set of targets and goals. I may not have responded to the science question on the relationship between climate and biodiversity. Perhaps let me respond very quickly and very simply that let's call it the two facets of the same aspect of nature. Nature incorporates climate, nature incorporates biodiversity. This is the biosphere that we live in, the Earth, and the linkages between the climate crisis, the crisis of climate changes, and its consequences that we're seeing now, and biodiversity loss are multiple, both positive. Nature can help us address climate change from a mitigation adaptation standpoint, but climate change dearly affects nature and drives the crisis of nature erosion.
So Anne, turning to the investor perspective, what are you seeing? How are investors evaluating and integrating nature and biodiversity risk and opportunities into their investment portfolios? And how do you make preservation of nature part of responsible fiduciary investing?
Well, thank you very much for having us all.
I was just laughing with Camille and saying, we thought we should sing to you, right? Fly me to the moon.
or something. It's the perfect question when we're talking about investors. I mean, what I'm struck by with many of these UN gatherings and COP meetings is that the money is in the hands of the private sector. So this sort of takes me back to the old, joke about Willie Sutton, who's a bank robber and of some notoriety in the United States. And he allegedly was asked in the dock in court, why do you rob banks? And Willie Sutton said, because that's where the money is. And I feel that we have that Willie Sutton moment in private finance on a regular basis, which is, hey, we've got several $100 trillion of money in the private sector, and we need money to invest on a whole range of different topics. And government has a role, multilateral development banks have a role, philanthropy has a role, but the big money is in pension funds and insurance companies and in banks. Now, the bit we tend to forget, and Brian, my old colleague from CalSTRS, is here, our day job working in pension funds when I was at CalPERS is it's not only that we have to think about our responsibilities for the impact of our investment, we've also got to make money doing it because we're paying pensions. And when I was at CalPERS, we used to produce this dollar bill which showed that for every dollar we pay out in pensions, 60 cents comes from investment returns. And I think this is what was being talked about in the previous two panels. We have to be able to both address these systemic issues, take care of our game of Jenga, as you put it so well, but we've also got to make money in the process, not for some greedy, rotten, horrible, capitalists who, but actually for ordinary working people. The money in the private financial system belongs to hundreds of millions of hard-working families and people putting their savings into the system to pay for their retirement, their health, their education, their mortgage, even to save a little for a rainy day. So we don't have a choice about this fiduciary duty question. So what we have to do, I think, is rethink our whole strategy on investment. And this is what we did at CalPERS, and it's what we're doing at Franklin Templeton, where I work at the moment. Rather than talking about ESG, which is always tricky because there's no F for finance, right? Could be ESG anything, ESG muffins, ESG hairdressing. No, we've got to actually think, what does this mean in the context of fiduciary duty, is exactly as you're asking. So what we have to do is actually go back to old-fashioned economics, really, really old-fashioned economics, which says, where do we get value from? How do we create value? And first of all, financial capital, we all understand that bit, it's our day job. We deploy the savings of others. We are fiduciaries because it's not our money. And therefore we have duties of prudence, of loyalty, of care. And they go back centuries, these ideas. Once you've got that in place, you then have to think, well, money, deploying money really will get you nowhere, even if you think you believe in something like Bitcoin. Money does not create value. It only turns into value once it's combined with people's labour and innovation. We call that human capital. We've got two forms of capital now. And then we have to realise companies need an amount of water, natural resources, rare earths. Think about even the transition on climate change. We're going to need cobalt. We're going to need all the raw materials for these new forms of energy storage. So natural capital is the third part of this model. Now, if we kiss goodbye and a fond farewell to the acronym ESG, right, RIP to ESG, thank you for your service and off you go, we now have to be more ambitious. We have to say the savings of the global financial system have to generate a risk-adjusted return, but they also have to attend to these other crises that we're dealing with. So this is really like that Oscar movie, isn't it? Which I loved the title of more than the film itself, which gave me a headache, I have to say. But everything, everywhere, all at once. So sitting here and saying, oh, it's very complicated, it's like too late. You're in the wrong job if complexity bothers you in some way. Go and find something simple to do, like, I don't know, design knitting patterns or something orderly and predictable. If you're in finance, your whole job is about deploying other people's money into uncertainty. And I know baseball was being quoted earlier, but one of my favourites of a baseball player, you might know Camille, we're both foreigners. I don't know baseball either, but I do love this Yogi Berra quote where he said, The future is uncertain because it hasn't happened yet. So we have to have some sense of agency about the role of finance, but we've got to be able to invest it in this three-part understanding of forms of capital. So we think about natural capital, human capital, and financial capital. What then comes out of that is the idea that markets need two things. One, information. We need information about what's happening with financial capital. We've had 150 years to sort of work that out on accounting and audit. Then human capital. We get precious little information. Think about the S&P 500. Close to 90% of the balance sheet is intangible value. We don't yet have reporting on the essentials of human capital. The SEC, bless their cotton socks, has got stuff in the works. Then natural capital, and that's why these reporting initiatives are so important. So that's number one. Markets need information, and we're just beginning. I want to just give a big round of applause to the IFRS, the International Financial Reporting Standards body. I used to sit in their advisory council. I know this has been a 10-year project, but they have now rolled out what they're calling S1 and S2 for public markets for 144 jurisdictions. So I do think it's very important that we actually think about these different reporting formats coming together so that we have a choir, we have some harmony between these different reporting formats. We can't just have private best practice initiatives coming out, and we've also got regulated international standards. It's all got to meet up at some point. So that's number one, information. And then we've got the same challenge in private markets. There are groups at ILPA, another Novata, where one of our board members is the founder. We've got to get the private markets in this game as well, because otherwise assets are getting dumped into, or sold into, I should say, private markets. The emissions don't change. They just disappear from the beautifully net zero aligned portfolio report that someone who's just sold that stuff to another investor is able to claim. So information is number one. Number two, incentives. Now, carbon pricing has been rightly mentioned. It's actually now covering close to a third of global emissions, and there are different ways of doing it, and it can generate revenues. But making sure that externalities, back to economics, are being priced. Carbon pricing isn't just it. It's also on natural resources like water, like biodiversity. We've got to understand externalities, and we've got to price that. But we've also got to address the issue of subsidies. So there is a huge amount of money still going into subsidising heavy carbon forms of energy, and we've got to find a way to wean ourselves off that whilst maintaining affordable access to energy in the transition, which leads me to my last little point, back to human capital. As I understand it, 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is being taken care of by indigenous communities. So if we don't put people at the centre of this, and the protecting of indigenous communities and First Nations at the centre of this, we won't actually get the biodiversity progress that we need. So, final word, yes, the private sector has the money, but the private sector, as yet, does not have the information, and secondly, does not have the incentives aligned to deploy capital effectively. So that project is a conversation and a partnership with civil society and with policymakers. So thank you.
Great. So you touch on the gaps in information and data, and we often hear that, the data is not there, it's not good enough, what can we do without the data? We also know that CDP launched in the year 2000, 23 years on, we still have major gaps in emissions data. So we can't wait 23 more years to get data to tackle this. So maybe Vian first, what are you seeing? What can investors do? What are the solutions to these data gaps and challenges, and how are they dealing with those challenges?
Yeah, thanks Naomi, and what a wonderful exposition of where we are today in terms of how this can be relevant for the investment community. I myself created nature data because I wanted nature data to be able to see the impact of my investment portfolio on nature, and there just was nothing in 2020. So I always say I'm a double agent. Really, I'm a conservationist at heart, working in finance, like many of us are. We have a mission somewhere, and suddenly this rise of ESG data started to happen. I wanted to understand the impact of my investments on the things around me in my pension fund so I could engage with my pension fund, and that's why we created data. And that brings us on to the data question. So I would categorize, just very quickly, data as it stands in two areas. First of all, we have the descriptive, and that's where we're chipping away at today with regards to nature and biodiversity. So in that category, we're starting to be able to describe at a relatively high level, certainly a relative level, a company's material impacts on nature and their dependencies, given the sorts of things that they're doing. A lot of that comes from the science. But then the most important piece of this puzzle that's different and complex that Camille has alluded to is the location specificity of these companies, because biodiversity is location specific. So we need to understand where they are. Big data gaps there that I'm sure Jeff is going to start to expose what's going on in that world to reveal what's going on. Then what are the supply chains to these companies, and how does that affect their impact, their material impacts and dependencies? Then we have a whole wealth of scientific information and models that can help us achieve some kind of footprinting idea. So if I'm doing this and I'm operating in this area, then this is the likely impact, and these are the likely ecosystem services that I'm using, along with the specifics of where the company is. Start to get a sense of describing this company's impacts and dependencies and how that might affect them today. What's then interesting, though, is moving into the future. And so we have descriptive metrics today at some level. Where we're going, though, is predictive metrics, which is really what the market wants, to try and understand the uncertainty. And so in that area, understanding the scenarios we're moving into, very, very light at the moment, but there is something there, and we've managed to put together an idea of biodiversity value at risk for companies. And then the increasing gap filling of where companies are is happening as we speak because of technology that is emerging incredibly fast. And so descriptive today, prescriptive today and into tomorrow, and three key areas. One, locate and identify where the company is. That's in all of the frameworks that you're seeing proliferate. Then measure their impacts and dependencies, again, common to all the frameworks. And then finally, as stewards of capital, act. That's also key. How do investors engage through things like the Nature Action 100 Plus, through your stewardship activities? How do you engage with those companies to move them to a nature positive trajectory, such as the one that Camille has outlined, set out by the Global Biodiversity Framework?
Could I just... That was brilliant, and I really love this distinction that you're making between the sort of predictable, the scenario side, and the descriptive of where we are. But I just wanted to make a reference to what investors, and many of you in the room are part of this Climate Action 100 Plus initiative, because I think it's given us an understanding of how to be effective on stewardship. And just to let you know, we, using the data that were available at the time, the very wonderful Divya Mankikar led this work. She's now one of the big data providers, S&P. We found at CalPERS that among our 10,000 companies, about 100 were responsible for the vast bulk of the emissions. So in other words, we didn't have to try and run after 10,000 companies. What we've done now through that initiative, which I think has close to 70 US trillion in signatories, pursuing the idea of addressing this risk that we're facing on emissions, the reduction that's so important. We have commitments from those companies equivalent to 25% of global emissions out of 100-ish companies. Think about that. That is like getting your hands on the emissions of China and getting the commitment to net zero by 2050. Now, that is all being buffeted hard and heavy by what's happened post-Ukraine invasion, COVID, a whole string of different geopolitical, national, domestic, and economic macro and micro factors are impacting those commitments. And investors have got the tough job now of being in partnership with those companies to make that transition happen. But the commitments are there. And that has now inspired other examples on water, on biodiversity, and also on human rights. So I think it shows that we need to be grounded in the evidence, we need to be data-driven, and we need to be good fiduciaries without breaching competition law, rules on concert parties and groups. Because the other thing we all face, which is a challenge, is overcoming a tragedy of the commons and also maintaining individual fiduciary responsibility for decisions. But I think that working model has given us all a sense of how to do this in practical terms. But thank you for letting me just chip in.
No, absolutely. So one big difference between now and the year 2000 is clearly there's been significant advancements in technology and AI. And so, Jeff, can you tell us a bit about kind of how you see AI helping to address some of these challenges?
Yes, happy to. Hi everyone, I'm Jeff. I'm at Google. You may have heard of us. We're a technology company. We operate in a bunch of countries around the world. So this year has absolutely been kind of the year of AI. You know, it's become very, very commonplace and in the sort of the discussion. How we think about AI is actually how it connects to our sustainability strategy globally. And overall, and so there's sort of three pillars that we look at our sustainability strategy. The first is empowering individuals in their everyday lives. In fact, in 2022, Google helped more than 1 billion people make more sustainable choices in their everyday life. So I like to point out, for example, when you're using Google Maps for driving directions, there's something called eco routing that helps you save fuel or save energy if you use an EV. And these kind of small nudges, these small actions really add up. The second is working together with partners, and those partners can be folks like the folks here, MSCI, governments, public sector organizations, enterprises. And that's, I'm in cloud, and so we spend a lot of time working with those kinds of folks. Part of that ambition in working together is we're actually, Google has a stated goal of helping the world reduce or eliminate a gigaton of carbon emissions by 2030 annually. And so that's quite a lot of emissions. That's roughly the size of Japan's emissions today. Right? So we're working toward this sort of moonshot in that area. And then finally, operating sustainably is our third pillar. And what we do there is really focus on all of the attributes of sustainability, including nature, including biodiversity, including climate mitigation and adaptation. A good example of our ambition in operating sustainably is we are currently now matching 100% of our electricity use annually with renewable energy purchases, right? So we've been doing that since 2017, but obviously just that 100% RE match is leading, but it's not good enough, right? What you actually need to do is never have the emissions in the first place. So our next target is to have, by 2030, run all of our global operations on 24/7 carbon-free energy. So those are just some examples of kind of how we're thinking about it there. Turning a little bit more specifically to how AI can be deployed for nature and biodiversity, I think about geospatial as the first kind of lens of this, right? So I mentioned Google Maps. In addition to those kind of consumer, those kind of consumer applications that help folks, in their everyday lives, we also have a scientific platform called Earth Engine. And what Earth Engine does is it houses pretty much all of the satellite and remote sensing kind of imagery data sets that you might want from Landsat, Sentinel, other kinds of data sources. There's about 1,000 or plus data sources in this data set, over 100 petabytes of data that Google kind of manages for you, right? And so if you don't have to be a satellite imagery expert in order to actually start using it. So there's an analytics tool set, including the ability to create machine learning on top of those pixels and other sort of AI algorithms there. And finally, there's this enormous, really interesting community that's been built up over Earth Engine. Because it launched originally in the kind of the academic and research world, we've just brought it last year into the commercial world. So now folks in the investment community, consumer products goods companies, insurance companies, and others can really leverage this same technology that's super powerful at looking at the planet. So one example of how a consumer products goods company is doing this for specifically biodiversity is to look at the sustainability of their agricultural commodity supply chain, right? So sourcing things like palm oil, you know, the pledge is to basically never source any palm oil from deforested lands, right? And so how do you know actually where the palm fruit is harvested? It turns out that's actually kind of a hard problem if you're at the top, you know, if you're offering a shampoo or some other product that uses that commodity. There's quite a lot of complexity in terms of, you know, the growth and the production on the farms and the processing of mills. So we've actually used Earth Engine and geospatial analysis to create a likely sourcing area around each palm mill, right? And this actually greatly reduces, similar to how you're thinking about your portfolio, reduces actually the coverage area. And this is based on the amount of time that it takes, you know, between when you harvest palm fruit, when it has to be processed, that has to be done within a day, basically. So if you have a good sensitivity analysis we use what's called a friction surface map to do this, right? To create the likely sourcing area. And then you can overlay that, intersect that with deforestation events and land cover history, right? Because there's, you know, 40 years of satellite history available, you know, since you know, humankind have launched satellites up into orbit. So, you know, working that out, you can actually kind of get a little bit closer to the first mile sourcing opportunity there.
Could I chip in with a quick comment on what Jeff said? Jeff, first of all, just to say we love Earth Engine and use it, and our CTO is a 10-year user and loves it, and the data that comes out of it is extraordinary. And so matching that with data that comes out of the conservation organizations that feed into the CBD, IUCN, the work that's coming out of IBAT, UNWCMC, there's an extraordinary amount of data, but as you can see, sticking it all together and then understanding where companies actually are and attributing impact today, describing it today, and then predicting it into the future, this is where the complexity is, as we mentioned. But also,
Absolutely.
Jeff, I was going to say, do you remember I came to see you a few months back?
I do remember this, yes.
And I said, Jeff, it's all about nature and biodiversity. No, it's all about climate. So I was going to say, has it moved faster than you thought it would, or not so much?
I mean, all of this moves incredibly fast. You know, just the progress in generative AI, for example. You know, I mean, I think it was last year the world was introduced to ChatGPT, right? And suddenly, you know, everyone is using AI for everything all at once. Yeah, so, you know, I absolutely, the progress has been pretty brilliant. It's really great to see, you know, frameworks like TNFD and businesses, you know, really thinking about location strategy, you know, tracking your asset locations, understanding that it is a very granular type of problem. And it's not just like where the factory is or where the mine is, but it's also through, as you said, you know, from the river, you know, into the forest, and, you know, and it's all super interrelated.
Great. So you just touched on the TNFD, and we know that on Monday, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures launched their inaugural risk management framework and disclosure framework that follows the global biodiversity framework from COP15. So there's been a lot of developments from the policy perspective. So can you touch a bit, Camille, on what we're seeing there, why it's moving so fast, and what does this mean for investors and companies?
Yes, of course. I think if we go back a couple of years, is that working? If we go back a couple of years back, 2019, 2020, I think Vian, you touched on that. The importance of nature and nature loss as a risk to businesses, and by extension as a risk to the economy, was largely a new concept. And the linkages between nature and climate were vastly ignored by policymakers and the business community. What we have seen over 2 years is a very rapid awareness rising of the interlinkages between climate change and its consequences and biodiversity loss. And if you think about this, you know, the wildfires season in the Northern Hemisphere and beyond that took place this year, it's not only about carbon or trees burning, it's about whole ecosystems disappearing. With them, water regulation, which creates a risk for irrigation. With that, pollinator loss, which creates a risk to crops, etc., etc. So over a few years, voices have been calling for a recognition of the importance of nature loss as a risk to business and as a risk to the entire economic and financial stability. And some landmark reports came out recently, in fact, from the Network for Greening the Financial System, which is a central bank and financial supervisors group, on recognizing the importance of nature loss as a risk to financial stability. Now, coming back to the TNFD. The TNFD is a voluntary initiative. I won't lecture you on it because you can find it all on the internet now that it's launched. It's a set of recommendations for assessing and reporting publicly on an organization's exposure to nature-related risks. So how does nature loss affect the value, resilience, and long-term operations of the organization? And impacts. How does the company impact nature? The TNFD is a voluntary approach, and it has been highly consultative and iterative in its development, meaning that it is highly integrated with the TCFD, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and various other standards and frameworks. I'll try to not be too long, but I would like just to touch on comments that were made. On ISSB, I think you made a comment on IFRS and ISSB. ISSB adopted two standards on disclosures, one on general sustainability disclosure, one on climate-related disclosure. We hope that they will work on biodiversity.
Yes.
At least they announced their intention to integrate the TNFD recommendations within their works. This is 144 countries across the world. The CBD is 196 countries around the world. I think this tells us that beyond voluntary initiatives, which clearly are aligned with the Global Biodiversity Framework adopted at COP, we should be expecting a shift in the policy environment and the regulatory environment within countries to drive requirements for disclosures, hopefully in a fairly consistent manner across geographies. And I think that this is really something to be aware of within the business and finance community. It is about voluntary internalization of economic externalities or environmental externalities, but it is also about anticipating regulatory shifts that will be happening in the coming years as countries implement ISSB recommendations, the CBD, Global Biodiversity Framework, etc. And I think that at institutional level, we are very grateful of that, of tech companies such as Google and data providers, innovating companies that are really driving the solution side of that whole nexus. And this is really enabling and empowering policymakers in their work. Solutions are being provided by the market. This is really fantastic.
Yeah, last night we were fortunate to have Lael Bernard, the director of the National Economic Council, speaking with us at an event, and she really reviewed the Inflation Reduction Act and how that's helping to spur private capital to address climate change. And I'm wondering, Anne, do you see any similar policies that could help spur action from investors on biodiversity, and or any reflections on that?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. And I just want to underline what Camille was just saying. We have this first time ever global framework for sustainability reporting being rolled out. We're very honoured. We sit on the investor advisory group to that initiative. So investors have got their word in the ear here to say we need harmony. We must use the opportunity to pilot best practice and be practical, but then it's got to be taken up through the main legitimate standard setting bodies so that we don't have arbitrage, which is a real problem. So I think for investors, we've got two roles. One obviously is in relation to deploying capital. You know, exactly as Vian was just saying, as stewards of other people's money. So we have a responsibility when we're engaging with companies, both in private markets and in public markets, as debt and as equity investors. We forget that sometimes. So that's one part of the job. But then we also need to be the advocates for the policy and regulation. So, you know, the way we think about this is you've got the invisible hand of the market. Thank you, Adam Smith, for this beautiful metaphor from many hundreds of years ago. But we need the visible hand, the partnership, the visible hand of policy, because this represents the legitimate standard setting role. So I think investors have to pay attention to making sure that the policy that's being developed actually aligns with the fiduciary duty that we have, which is inviolable. And to the point earlier about short, medium and long term, you're going to have to, you know, like with CalSTRS, you've got a 100-year view of your liabilities, but you've also got to put cash on the table for pensioners on a month-by-month basis. So it's not a matter of a trade-off. So maybe the everything all at once, everything everywhere all at once is not just about now, it's about being able to think about the long term. I mean, Maynard Keynes famously said, didn't he, that we all focus on the short term because in the long term we're all dead. Well, if you're a pension fund, you're not given that luxury of thinking that way, because your fiduciary duty extends to your beneficiaries as a category coming forward in the future. So think like a pension fund would be my advice. Then you become long-term, a good fiduciary, and you take all the risks into account that you should. So.
All right, so my final question is for everyone to share one word that you'd like to leave the audience with, although I was going to preempt it and say maybe it should be everything, everywhere, all at once. And that kind of, Vian, I'll let you kick off.
One word. I've got three. Awareness, regulation, and technology. Three things we've never seen come together. Sorry, three things we've never seen come together in this way before. Awareness, regulation, and technology.
I have two. We're both breaking the rules here on the number of words. I have two: bold and responsible. So this is how we think about AI. Thank you very much.
Just saying.
I don't know if the and counts.
It's a word.
It's a sight word.
Fiduciary.
Let's say advocate and be proud of it.
Great. Well, thank you all so much. It's clear that we're going to have to be very bold, take action, move quickly, but we have the tools and we have the learnings from what we've done with climate to accelerate all of this, and we'll need to partner and collaborate across many sectors to do this. So thank you all very much, and let's all take action and go forth. Thank you.